oftentimes looked at as being primitive or backward. Said describes it as being a sort of perceived by the first world as being this very ritualistic affair, and that it's based in ludicrous notions of how the world operates. Okay, and so the juxtaposition that is created in understanding and orientalizing the rest of the world in this way is their religion is primitive, our religion is correct. Okay, and so it's Orientalism, orientalizing the rest of the world, is a means of achieving power and moral superiority for the first world. That's very important to remember for this argument. Okay, and so Stam is drawing off of Said, he's drawing off of Orientalism, and he's drawing off of the first world. He's drawing from the first world's tendency to label the third world incorrectly as being primitive. Okay, and so it's important for us to remember that particular understanding of the third world in order to understand how the third world responds to, through artistic practices and film practices, how the third world responds to the first world and to neocolonialism in the 1960s and in the 1970s. Right? He draws attention to one influence here that I think is useful, and that influence is Italian neorealism. And if you remember when we talked in class on Wednesday, we talked about how third cinema defines itself against both the first cinema and the second cinema. Okay, but there are others within a larger third world cinema movement that see Italian neorealism as supplying the aesthetic template for how one makes a resistant form of cinema. It might not be resistant in its exhibition venue, okay? So it might still exist within capitalism, but the aesthetics are resistant. And there are a number of important political activists, theorists, filmmakers in this particular chapter that touch on how Italian neorealism inspires a particular understanding of an aesthetics of resistance. Okay, when I say aesthetics of resistance, what I'm referring to in Italian neorealism is the ability to aestheticize what is lacking in that cinema. And what is lacking in that cinema is the financial means, the technological means, the industrial means to produce polished, big-budget Hollywood productions. Okay? Italian neorealism, post-war European film movement. The beginnings of Italian neorealism occur at if you go back and you watch Roma, Open City, that's a film. At certain moments, it looks very different. You can see that there's a very different look to the film. And the reason for that is because in producing the film, they had to use different types of film stock because film stock, immediately after the Second World War, was not readily available, particularly in Europe. And that's a way in which you make what you lack an aesthetic quality of your film. And so Italian neorealism, defined by non-professional actors, defined by on-location shooting, defined by, at least initially, meager budgets. This is actually sort of a misunderstanding of Italian neorealism that the films weren't well budgeted. Later on, they were, okay? And so the aesthetic, I don't want to call it disingenuous, but it was at least in part artificially produced once you get towards the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, but immediately after the Second World War, these are filmmakers working with handheld cameras, with a very amateur aesthetic, doing what they can in order to produce the films that they want to produce. So that becomes this is a roundabout way of saying that Italian neorealism becomes the aesthetic template for a lot of the resistance cinema that is produced in Latin America in the 60s and in the 70s. And Stam is going to talk at a number of instances here about how there were a number of different Latin American filmmakers who either traveled to Italy or studied in Italy or gave talks in Italy. So he makes this very clear. He talks about Cesare Zavattini was a screenwriter and to a lesser extent a co-director, but he was a screenwriter in Italy. He talks about how he traveled to Cuba and Mexico in 1953. I'm reading from this to talk about the possibilities of Latin American versions of neorealism. And you're going to see this codified in Latin American cinema over the coming 2 decades. So the aesthetic template is there. What isn't there yet is the industrial and the distribution template, and that will be realized through manifestos like what we read on Wednesday, Third Cinema, which argues for a guerrilla cinema, a sort of underground cinema that exists as much as possible outside of capitalism. I do want to spend a little bit of time giving context to and elaborating on a couple of the essays, what I referred to here on 95 militant film manifesto essays. We have read and talked about Towards a Third Cinema, but I also want to make clear the Globa Rocha's Aesthetics of Hunger, and also Leo Garcia Espinosa's For an Imperfect Cinema. And I want to make clear what these essays perhaps have in common in terms of their end goals, and also in terms of how they understand this sort of newly political resistant cinema. And so the first one that I'll talk about is Aesthetics of Hunger. It starts towards the bottom of 95. And the Aesthetics of Hunger, it says here, Hocher called for a hungry cinema of sad, ugly films which would not only treat hunger as a theme, but also be hungry in their own impoverished means of production. In a displaced form of mimesis, the material poverty of style would signal real-world poverty. Aesthetics of Hunger is a call not just for depictions of impoverishment, okay? Depictions of hunger. So think of hunger here as an abstract expression of what it means, and a real bodily feeling of what it means to be impoverished, okay? What it means to be a subjugated people, a colonized people, okay? And so Rocha is calling for a cinema that not only depicts this hunger, but also is itself hungry. And this is where Italian neorealism is an important influence, because Italian neorealism supplies the aesthetic template for aestheticizing the impoverished conditions of production, aestheticizing the lack of money and the lack of capital that you have when you go in and you make a movie. Okay, it's in aestheticizing that, you make clear the conditions under which everyday people live, everyday people make films, etc., etc., etc. Okay, because it can all be seen in the aesthetics of the film itself. So instead of trying to imitate a glossy Hollywood style and failing at it, what Rocha wants is for filmmakers to show the shortcomings of their filmmaking, to show their financial limitations, to show their technological limitations. He wants for that to appear on screen. That's very similar to what Julio Garcia Espinosa says about imperfect cinema. The argument is very similar, okay? And on the sort of like the first main paragraph of 97, Stam writes, the Cuban Espinosa, meanwhile, in his 1969 essay for an imperfect cinema, called in carnivalesque fashion for the erasure of the line between artist and public. And we've already seen this demonstrated in Towards a Third Cinema. This is one of the hallmarks of political cinema, whether in Latin America or abroad during this time. There is a need for the intellectual to not be a neutral party, but to rather be a active participant in politics. And Towards the Third Cinema draws those links very clearly. What we're talking about here is praxis, okay? And praxis, it's a political praxis. Praxis, Praxis, is a combination of theory and practice. It's putting of a theory into practice. And that's what these filmmakers, these political activists, that's what they're trying to achieve here. And so it goes on to say, at a point when Cuban cinema was just beginning to acquire the capacity of producing a well-made cinema with high production values, Espinosa warned against the temptation of perfection. Perfection would be the aspiration to a Platonic ideal. That Platonic ideal would in this case be mainstream Hollywood cinema, big budget mainstream Hollywood cinema. Technically and artistically perfect cinema, he argued, is almost always a reactionary cinema. Okay. He therefore called for an imperfect cinema, not beholden to European aesthetic ideals, one energized by the low forms of popular culture and in creative dialogue with American cinema. If American cinema was born to entertain, and if European cinema was born to make art, Latin American cinema, for Espinosa, was born for political activism. Okay, and that's very important. And when he goes on to say that, when they go on to refer to this as a genuine popular art, popular in the context of this week refers not to mainstream, but rather for the people. Okay, and when we talk about national cinema, we're oftentimes talking about it in the same way. For the people, for the masses. Okay, so what could constitute popular cinema is, in Latin America at this time, in terms of the number of people viewing it, or in terms of box office revenue, or however you want to measure it, actually not popular at all. It's just for the populace, for the people. Okay. I wanted to make clear those two. The Getino Solanas essay, that we read for Wednesday, I think we have a pretty good handle on. This does give us some additional insight into what the third cinema means and what it's referring to, but I think we have a pretty good handle on Wednesday's essay. I will say that if you have any questions on anything, either related to Wednesday's essay or to Friday's or to today's essay, send me your questions over the weekend and I'll post them. If you also have questions retroactively about the Deleuze readings from last week, send me those and I'll post them. We didn't get any questions for Wednesday's reading, or last week's reading on Deleuze, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold those, if I do get questions, I'm going to fold those answers into this week, Deleuze week. I'll instead count everything from the Deleuze week into this week. Anyway, that's it. That's all I have for you. I will be back on Monday. Please make sure you sign the sign-in sheet before you go. If you do that, I will give you a free impromptu quiz point. Okay, so you get credit for a free impromptu quiz. If you have any questions, again, please contact me. I'll be in my office next week. You can email me over the weekend, but it might take until Monday for me to be able to respond to you. Otherwise, that's it. Have a good weekend. Enjoy your day.